You are listening to Cantus Firmus. I have as a guest today John A. Dangelo III, the gentleman who's behind the website antiwarwarvet.com. And I think from there I might just jump into questions, because I suspect that people who hear that already know kind of what we're getting into and are curious about the background, this sort of interesting dichotomy of an anti-war vet. So John, what is your background? Did you grow up in a military family or a Christian family, and did those two connect in any way?
Hey Cody, yeah, thanks for having me. So I did not grow up in a Christian household. My grandmother, I grew up with a single mom and a grandma, and my grandmother was a kind of a rosary praying Catholic, but she stopped showing up to mass after my grandfather had left. And it was a pretty ardent military supporting family. Most of the men in my family were military, but it was not because of any Christian ethic. It was more of like that deontological life of service sort of thing. Everybody was making a pragmatic decision to join and thought it was sort of their duty. And that's what motivated me at the time too.
Gotcha. Would the words I've heard, like, sort of the cult of the state, where there's this kind of, almost a reverence and or almost sort of a religious fervor for, for country and for particularly the military, those people who, put it on the line, risk their lives in order to support their country and those sort of things. Would the cult of the state be too negative of a phrase to attach to kind of like what that experience was like for you, or?
I don't think they would appreciate that moniker, but I think that's probably more or less the case. Yeah. And, after the paradigm shift I've had into anarchism and into being a professing Christian, I definitely see more of that now. But there wasn't so much an irreverence as, and I noticed this a lot in a lot of the families that I know that are big military supporters. It is really just sort of an outgrowth of patriotism and again, that sort of duty-based lifestyle, that this is something that we have to do as Christian men or American men or whatever, that we have to support the state and the military, and we have to love the troops because they're supporting some freedom that nobody can really list. And I think that was more or less my experience growing up.
Got it. And where did you grow up, out of curiosity?
I grew up in a small suburban town called Wallingford in Connecticut, central Connecticut. Okay.
Sounds nice. And so when you get a little bit older and you start thinking about joining the Marines, and is that just kind of an outgrowth of that sort of background that sort of, lionizes or appreciates the, those who are in the military, or what's behind the decision to join for you?
Yeah. It's funny. The summer before I enlisted in September of the following September after I graduated high school. And I was in that summer I spent in Chicago doing slam poetry, of all things, for Brave New Voices, which is like this national competition. Mm-hmm. And so I was kind of like not a lefty, but I definitely sort of started to lean that way because it was a very progressive scene. And, I had the long hair, and my uncle Glenn, who was a high-ranking coastie at the time, had come home and seen that I, was sort of misdirected and didn't really have any plans. He basically dragged me to the recruiter's office and told me to pick a door. And I picked the Marines because no one in my family had done it yet.
Wow. Okay. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
So, I mean, when you say that he dragged you, was there, how much of it did you feel like was a decision that you were making? Was it just that he gave you that little push, or was it like that you really didn't want to do it?
I didn't really feel strongly either way. A lot of the decisions I made in my early life were sort of whimsical and just on a fly. In that case, I didn't really have a strong idea of what I wanted to do, and I had done so poorly in high school that college wasn't an option. Mm-hmm. So it seemed to me to be the most sensible thing for my life, even though I didn't particularly want to do it. I didn't feel strongly against it, that's for sure.
Yeah. Maybe it seemed like you had more career options than doing slam poetry.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think that was going to work out for my my bottom line.
Understand. So where were you? So first of all, when was this? And then where were you deployed and what did you do?
Yeah, so I enlisted in 2009. I left in 2010, and I got home. I was a reservist, so I got home at the end of 2010, and then at the end of 2010, I got orders immediately to go back on for active orders, which is like when a reservist gets deployed, they get put back in active duty for deployment. And I got those orders at the beginning of 2011, and I was in Afghanistan by September 2011 after a workup and everything.
Oh, wow. Wow. So, and what were you primarily doing when you were there?
So I was a truck driver, and I drove MRAPs, which are like the trucks that we get the privilege of seeing all of our police departments drive around in, and then bigger trucks, which are called LVSs, which are big load-bearing trucks, sort of like a tractor trailer. And we drove those primarily. So I was attached to Second Supply, which is a company or a battalion out of North Carolina, and we were their truck company for the time being during deployment, and we were tasked with providing fuel security, which turned out to be a U.S. jobs program because the military didn't want to spend the money to send armored fuel trucks overseas, but that was the primary way that we moved fuel throughout the whole country. So instead of having armored trucks, which wouldn't leak, obviously, when they got shot, we would pay local Afghans who owned regular fuel trucks, about $2,000 American to take the convoy with us, and we ostensibly provided security for them.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. So did you, if you don't mind me asking, did you run into combat yourself there, or did you manage to avoid that?
Yeah, so our entire convoys, we all kind of saw it in varying degrees. I was hit by a small IED in December of 2011, but it didn't really cause any harm. I was absolutely fine. But that was what my combat action ribbon was attached to. But we got shot at, and we hit IEDs pretty regularly. It was more of a war of attrition. The Taliban knew that they weren't going to really cause much harm, if at all, to us. So what they were trying to do was shoot the sides of these trucks that were not armored, because the fuel costs about $97 a gallon, or at least that's what I had heard. By the time it got loaded onto the trucks, and then you add in all the externalities for us as the guys that were providing security, and the $2,000 for every Afghan driver. So it was really an expensive undertaking for the military, and something that the Taliban had appreciated.
Yeah. Well, it seems that in these kinds of things where there's one side is very outmatched by the other, it's less about winning the battle through conventional means, and more about just making the other side totally discouraged. Is that fair to say, that they were just kind of just trying to lower your morale?
Yeah, and even if it wasn't lowering morale, I mean, I think anybody who appreciated the U.S. military's position, or the individual actor on the ground, our morale was probably fine. But Osama bin Laden was pretty clear that his point in doing these sorts of things and trying to incite us into a war in the Middle East was not because they were going to defeat us in some prophetic end of the world scenario battle. They were trying to make us hemorrhage money, and that's precisely what they've been doing since 2003.
Oh, wow, that's interesting. Okay, so I'd be curious. I imagine that in a lot of situations like that, it becomes very personal. But I know that I'm sure that there are also, people who are on the ground who think of it as just as a job, something you do. And I wonder how, you started to look at Afghanistanis and Taliban, and just kind of, and did you separate in your mind the locals from the combatants? And anyway, just kind of what was your, I guess, sort of psychological state as you're there?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was 20. I turned 21 while I was over there. So I was young, and I was not ideological at all. I didn't really have much thought for the Afghans. I thought it was cool that I got to cruise around in some Wild West scenario in an armored vehicle. It felt like, playing a video game almost. You're more or less safe. And the combatants, or the enemy, or however you want to label them, the insurgency didn't really feel like they were a true threat. However, the idea about separating the locals from the combatants, we learned fairly early on. Even on pre-deployment, they would talk to us about how the Taliban would go into small villages, and they would coax men of the family they would give them rifles and then give them money And I've never actually sourced any of this since, but I just remember hearing this in pre-deployment briefs and stuff. They would give these guys money, and in return, they would threaten them to fire at us, or they would threaten their family. And so it was really messy. It's not like these guys were Taliban or even ideological. They weren't even really raising up arms against an occupying force. A lot of times they were doing it under the threat of violence on the other side. And, that's pretty powerful to think about when you start to, we would have these truck drivers with us in our convoys. Some of these missions took over 2 weeks. So we'd be out in the middle of nowhere with these guys. We get to know them a little bit, even if they don't speak English. You see their behaviors. It's tough to not humanize them in situations like that and realize that they're in often untenable situations themselves.
Yeah, wow. I mean, as you're there and you're kind of looking at it from the ground, did it seem to you at the time that we were accomplishing our mission there, or?
Well, that's the funniest thing about all of this, right? Like, we never knew what the mission was, and even if any of us were to say that we thought it was anything, it would most likely be the safe haven myth that we had to make sure that we made Afghanistan secure from insurgencies ever allowing terrorists to occupy there again. We heard that over and over during pre-deployment, and even I'm sure it was bandied about while we were deployed. But I think if you were to poll any of us on the ground at the time, it probably would have been the idea that we were getting revenge for 9/11. The bad guys were so wily and crafty that they had to be sought out in every Afghan nook and cranny, and that was our job,
Wow. So at what point do you start to question either the efficacy or the morality of what you're doing, or what we're doing? Maybe is a better way to say it.
I think early on I started to realize that because there wasn't exactly an end goal, we were more or less running in place at best. But through a series of different events, you see people get hurt, or one of our early missions, we had gotten an intelligence brief afterwards that we had hurt a bunch of innocent people, potentially killing a bunch of them. And they had actually taken one of the weapons that we were allowed to use on our trucks, called a Mark 19, which is an automatic grenade launcher. They had taken it from our company. We weren't allowed to use them anymore because we had apparently hurt a bunch of innocent people. I say we as our company, not me particularly. But when you start to think about that and think about the human toll of what you're doing, it doesn't become a video game anymore. And you suddenly start to realize that there's other people on the end of this. And I think all of those things, the sort of silliness about the convoys and how much we were paying out to these Afghans, and the human toll on the ground, it became hard not to question the efficacy of what we were doing. And it certainly wasn't hard to question the morality of it.
Now, were these concerns that you expressed with people in your company, and did they share some of your concerns, even if they didn't end up going quite where you went with it?
I think, the answers I'm giving you now are definitely after a lot of thought and reflection. At the time, I just wasn't so comfortable celebrating this idea of killing bad guys and fighting for freedom. But we definitely talked about, as a group, I think we all sort of shared the idea that this was sort of a silly thing and a waste of time. I don't think we ever took that next step to say, are we really fighting for freedom or for the safety of others? Because when you come home and people see you in uniform, you're paraded about in different, whether actual parades or even like events at bars and gatherings, people incessantly come up to you and thank you for your service, and thanks for keeping America safe or whatever. And those sorts of things really started to weigh on me, not because of anything I had particularly done, but because we were doing something closer to the opposite of that. And I couldn't help but think, if anything, we're making America objectively less safe. And I started to investigate, and that's when I kind of came to the conclusions I've come to.
That's interesting. So, this is something I think about. You brought up this question of whether or not soldiers are actually fighting for our freedom. And it seems, it seems like on one level, a perfectly valid question to ask, an important one to ask, in fact. But I think it comes off as, almost I don't know, rude or callous to ask that question, you know, and I think it partly maybe just because of how we sort of make soldiers into saints a little bit, if you want to use that language of the cult of the state, and so it becomes very dicey because people put together the idea of these people who are making this tremendous sacrifice, and often with very good intentions, with what's actually the outcome of what our policies are. And so I'd be interested in hearing, it's something I struggle with a little bit because I don't want to come off as insensitive or like a cad. But, I mean, this whole question of are they fighting for our freedom, and is that disrespectful to soldiers to really ask whether or not that has been the outcome?
I think it's totally an appropriate question. I also think, especially as ANCAPs or libertarians on social media, you'll see a lot of guys with the police and the military. They're often really quick to sort of expect that they appreciate our position and therefore attack them on those grounds, when oftentimes cops and the military, they're not thinking in the same paradigm at all. And so I think for me, as someone who came from that world and works around these people all the time, I can sort of appreciate that they're not, their intentions are not ill will towards others, but they're just completely, I think, cynical in a lot of ways. And it's important to ask those questions. And anybody who is specifically a soldier in the military at all and prides themselves on having fought for freedom, they have to appreciate that question comes with the freedom they fought for. And maybe that you didn't fight for freedom at all is a thing that you should grapple with as a soldier, or as a vet, because there's so much writing and scholarship on this. And I recommend antiwar.com every time I talk to a vet about this stuff. But there's no question that we're objectively less safe if the reasons that Osama bin Laden and the cast of characters that flew planes into 9/11, the towers on 9/11, were releasing their motivations truly, which was that we were starving the Iraqis and we had troops in Saudi Arabia. We've only expounded on that policy and doubled, tripled, quadrupled down on it. What we're doing in Yemen today, Iraq, our posture towards Iran, Libya, Syria, the list goes on and on. All of those places are potential breeding grounds for future terrorists because of what we've done. And I think soldiers, the actors on the ground who are carrying out these sorts of policies, they should grapple with that. And they should really be willing to ask themselves if maybe they were doing something closer to the opposite of fighting for freedom.
I appreciate what you said about, one of the, if soldiers are fighting for our freedom, one of those freedoms is to ask the question whether or not what they're actually fighting for, at least in the end anyway, what the end result is for our freedom. And I think the fact that it's a difficult and uncomfortable question is really what makes it important, because, freedom of speech is not supposed to be the freedom to, talk about the weather. It's the freedom to bring up difficult questions without having to worry about, being thrown in prison for it, or, or be attacked for it.
And so in that vein, if I could just, a lot of times we forget a lot of these guys suffered or had friends who died alongside them. It's hard. That cognitive dissonance is often hard to overcome. It's not easy to say, my buddy died in Fallujah, therefore this whole thing is a lie. It's something closer to the opposite, that this has got to be just and right and noble because, friend X died doing it. And if it's not, then did he die in vain? And that's not a question that most people want to ask. And it's certainly not a question that politicians will ever raise.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point, right? Because we make this connection between what we do and what we think and who we are, and it's very disturbing to think about someone that you care about dying for nothing, and it almost, you see it as an insult to their memory that might be the case.
Yeah.
Wow. So at this point, going back to the story where you are there and you're questioning what's happening on the ground as far as just whether it's effective. At what point do you question whether it's right?
I don't know that I did any time. I'm sure I had inklings that I felt like this was wrong. But it wasn't until I came home and I started honestly, my first real introduction to libertarianism was Tom Woods' podcast. And he's just such an eloquent speaker, and he really puts a suit and tie to these radical ideas. And I think I needed that at the time. I mean, I still listen to him daily, but to hear this Harvard graduate and former professor talk about these really radical notions about foreign policy and introducing me to Scott Horton, those guys really started to help me shift from my beliefs more or less in what we were doing in Afghanistan to something now where I'm completely against all of our foreign policy. It took a nudge for sure from people with a developed ideology.
Okay, so that's interesting. So there's maybe a couple of things happening here. One of them is you have some firsthand experience that makes you question the policy. And then you start looking at or listening to libertarian, and you mentioned ANCAP, which is short for anarcho-capitalist. And you mentioned being an anarchist earlier too, so I'm sure that's going to come up in our conversation. But so you have experience, you have these sort of political views developing, and then at some point, Christian faith comes into this. And what happens there?
Yeah, so I met my wife at a bar of all places. She grew up in a Baptist home. She was in college in her senior year. I met her on her 21st birthday. And interestingly enough, it was sort of this intersection of my old life and my future life. I had met her at a military event. I was doing a Toys for Tots event of all things. And so I was in uniform. We were both intoxicated, not something we're proud of today, but she had kind of not fallen away from her faith, but certainly wasn't living up to it. And we together sort of rekindled that for her, and I got saved. I was not a professing Christian. If anything, I was like an agnostic atheist. I sort of prided myself on being intellectually superior to Bible thumpers and all this thing.
I've been there. I know what you mean.
Yeah. And, it's kind of amazing now to look back, knowing all of this incredible intellect that's been poured into Christianity. That's one of my more embarrassing views from the past. But so it sort of came to make sense. I got saved in 2012, and I started, regularly going to church and consuming the Word. And at the same time, I was starting to have these revelations about my politics, and it's kind of hard to decide which came first. I think clearly I was a Christian before I was an anarchist or a libertarian, but I often wonder if, and I think that this is probably something a lot of anarchist Christians grapple with, is am I conforming my faith or am I conforming my politics to my faith? And I believe I'm conforming my politics, but it's sort of that denouement of all those different threads kind of coming together. Yeah.
Well, the whole politics and religion thing is a complicated matter, just because we have these paradigms today that don't really exist in biblical times. So it's difficult to try to figure out how to make those things connect. For me, I'd written this book that was kind of the result of some research on what the Bible has to say about the relationship between the state or political kingdoms and these demonic powers. And, where I sort of landed thinking about those things and how the church was supposed to be sort of separate from these things, I haven't quite landed on something like full-throated anarchism or anything like that, but I have maybe a deep suspicion of the state that unfortunately a lot of Christians don't have. I mean, they do on some level. If the guy in office is the wrong political party, then they're very suspicious of statism and all those things. But otherwise they think it's quite wonderful to have the church aligned with the state.
Right.
But yeah, it's becomes complicated to tease those things apart, though. And so you have part of this is your Christian views as they relate to war, but how is your Christian beliefs, how have they informed your political views generally? So would you have gone maybe somewhat of a different direction, or maybe put a different nuance on your anarchist perspectives if it weren't for your faith?
Yeah, potentially. But I mean, there's so much secular political conversation out there related to anarchism. I think I may have been able to get there anyway, but I remember reading Tolstoy's The Kingdom of God is Within Us. And that was really powerful for me because I had never heard, I mean, he's a lefty economically anyway, but he really develops from the idea of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, and he extends that directly to our lives and how that should tangibly look, and talks about, we shouldn't have this idol of patriotism connected to our theology. If Jesus paid the price for you and I, he also paid the price for the Eurasian 1984 Eurasian nation outside of us, the others that we are so easy to paint as something other than human when we talk in political terms. Christ did not make any sort of motion towards the cross for just Central North America. He did that for the world. He made that available for the world. And understanding that there's a stark contrast between nationalism and a faith in Christ, I think that was really where I started to come down much further away from my Boy Scout patriotism that I had held for so long.
Gotcha. Well, is there, apart from this kind of idea of the idol of the state, one thing that I think comes up a lot for, libertarians and anarchists is this idea of coercion always being wrong. Does that connect with you at all for your Christian beliefs?
I think that might be, it certainly does, but I think that might be an even stronger argument in just tangible terms, so that you can make the point to even a secular audience that the state's only means to achieve anything is through coercion or the threat of violence. And clearly that's not something that is kosher with a Christian lifestyle, but and ironically, so many politicians pay lip service to being Christians, but I guess that's another conversation. The point is that it's not an acceptable or moral way to structure society. And there has to be a way for us as human beings to figure out a way to work voluntarily with one another. And any sort of, claims about egalitarianism or the leveling of the poor and the rich or the have-nots and the haves has to be on voluntary grounds, because otherwise the burden of proof has to lay on the egalitarian who's arguing for the redistribution of wealth or the limiting of one person's rights for the achievement of another. And I think that those points are much stronger to raise against the legitimacy of the state than anything necessarily Christian, because so many Christians have married their theology with some sort of nationalism.
Yeah. What I find maybe is one of the more persuasive things about libertarianism is this idea that, we start to kind of get to this place where everything we want to see happen as a society, we have to initiate violence to get it. And on some level, I think most people would say, okay, there's some things that I understand, like, okay, well, we're going to have to tax people for this or for that or the other thing, and taxation involves taking what someone else has earned and then taking it from them by force if necessary, and then punishing them if they don't give it up. But most people would say, okay, yeah, that's not great, I guess, but there's this thing that we really need as a society, and that seems kind of persuasive. But then you sort of go, okay, but who gets to determine what we need, and where do you stop it? Where does this thing stop? Because we keep multiplying these rights that people are supposed to have, not on the basis of just leaving them alone and letting them, have their own life and liberty, but like, okay, well, this person needs this person needs healthcare, education, or whatever. So then we start to take these things, and then you say, okay, where does this stop, really, ultimately? Because we can keep doing this basically forever. Right. And so maybe for me, although, like I said, I haven't really got into the anarchist camp, that tension that I have of sort of going, okay, yeah, but when does it stop? Why is it that I think it might be okay for this in this situation, but not in this other situation? And how can I really draw that line and be consistent about it? But that is the thing about the state that kind of makes it so scary, is that it's this like beast that never stops being hungry.
Yeah, and I think Spooner talks about this, Lysander Spooner, when he's talking about the Constitution, and he had quite an interesting intellectual arc in his work and his productive years. But he, at the time that he wrote No Treason, makes the argument that, look, we can't say that we have this Constitution, and this is at a time when the Constitution's allowances were much closer to what we imagined it was supposed to be in the late 19th century than it is today. But this is, after the Civil War had been fought and won, and he's arguing that we can't say that anyone has really given consent to this thing. And if we haven't all given consent to this, then how is it in any way legitimate? How is it a government by the people for the people if it's really just by a small contingent of people who then sold it to the rest of us? And it turned out, now we can say this in 2019, ultimately sold us a bill of goods, because if the Constitution did not, if the Constitution allowed for the government we have today, clearly it didn't do the thing that it was supposed to do, which is limit government.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I know a lot of Christian libertarians who don't go in for maybe full-throated pacifism, but they'll sort of say, okay, but at minimum we shouldn't be initiating violence, right? Are you one of those kind of non-interventionists Christian libertarians, or more of a pacifist Christian libertarian?
Yeah, this is something I struggle with even now, particularly because of the arguments from Tolstoy, actually. The idea of non-resistance to evil that Christ calls us to certainly is compelling, but I just don't know that it's completely practical. And, when I think about pacifism, I often think that that's sort of the ideal that I should be striving for. I'm certainly not violent in my everyday life, but I wonder now. I have a young son. I have a wife. My wife is actually pregnant, and I wonder now. If I had to defend my home, I wouldn't question doing that. But I struggle with it now, in the sort of freedom and peace that I enjoy at the moment, if that's necessarily the right thing. And then I think that maybe it's probably more directed towards your faith. If I were ever given the opportunity to martyrdom, or like those Egyptian Christians with the Islamic State, they didn't resist, particularly because of their call to peaceful non-resistance from Christ, I believe. And I don't know that that means that we can't ever defend ourselves, rather that we can't defend ourselves to defend our faith. We can't use violence to defend the name of Jesus.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, well, it sort of sounds like you're maybe on a similar place with pacifism that I am with anarchism.
Yeah,
where it's like, well, that sounds like a great place to go to, but I don't know if I'm quite ready to pull the trigger.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, what are you doing for a living now?
I work as a full-time emergency department nurse in a local hospital by me.
Wow. So, if I were a psychoanalyst, I might wonder if there's any connection to what you had done in the past in the Marines versus what you're doing now. Whether there is a desire to move past what you've done before and do something maybe opposite to that. Is that at all true, or is it just something that happened to work out?
I wish I could have said that I have a profound desire to heal because of things from my past, but no, I much like joining the Marines in the first place, me becoming a nurse was sort of the series, or the culmination of a series of decisions that revolved around advancing a career or whatever. I don't love being a nurse. I was originally on an ambulance, and I did that after I got home from Afghanistan for a lot of years. And then I didn't want to stay on the ambulance because it's sort of hard on your body, and you're out in the rain all the time. You don't make a ton of money. So I got my nursing degree so that I can sort of ameliorate some of those issues. And I've been doing it for about a year now. Not to say that it's not a great job and it's not something that I enjoy, but it's just not necessarily fulfilling for me.
Gotcha. But it wasn't something your uncle dragged you in to do either.
He did not bring me into the admissions office and force me to sign up. No.
Okay. All right. Do you have a message for Christians who see God and country as inextricably linked?
Yeah, I would just say that as a libertarian, I have my tangible sort of political arguments. And I think that those have been developed by much smarter people than I am. But as far as Christianity and patriotism particularly, I think that we need to think about the ritualistic way that we, especially as Americans, exist with nationalism, this idea of pledging allegiance to flags and all of the kind of gross mysticism we pay towards the Old Glory. It can't touch the ground and it has to fly higher than every other flag, including, interestingly, the Christian flag in many churches. We need to really start sort of shifting our views on that to closer to the Asherah pole and golden calf and further from a tie to our homeland. I think it's very natural for people and appropriate for people to view and have kinship with the place that they're from. But I think as Christians, we need to remember that our kingdom is not of this world, and we have an obligation to all people to spread the gospel and the good news of Christ, regardless of their ethnicity or their place of residence.
Yeah, I agree. So does that have an impact on, as you watch the news and you see all these debates about immigration and building walls, does that come into how you think about that issue when that comes up?
Yeah, I mean, that it's heartbreaking what's happening on our southern border. I definitely think that it's a hard question, and it's not. I don't think it's going to be one that's solved politically. That's for sure. I think that if we had a more robust system of private property rights, it would be a non-issue. Immigration is really sort of I think a natural outgrowth of how collectivized we view society in general. Because immigration is fairly easy when you start to consider your own property. It's much more complicated when you think about things collectivized and part of the public domain or whatever. So yeah, I would say for Christians, we should certainly be loving our literal and figurative neighbors, regardless of the political consequences. Certainly the practical results of something like a welfare state and unabashed borders is something that should be grappled with, and I think it is being grappled with, but there's certainly no calls to ending the welfare state as we know it. And, that's going to have to be something that plays itself out, I suppose. But for me personally, I just pray and hope for those people that they're safe. And I really do commend these people that are willing to make such a sacrifice to get to a place that's better. I can totally relate as a parent and as a husband to wanting to make those sacrifices or being willing to make those sacrifices. And I think that it's a difficult political situation and one I'm not glad I have to solve.
Yeah. I'm always interested in recommendations for, further reading and stuff like that. You've mentioned Lysander Spooner and Leo Tolstoy and even the Tom Woods podcast. Other than, well, actually, we'll get into what you're doing that people can look into, but do you recommend other resources as well for people who maybe are going down a path maybe toward just trying to figure out where they're going with some of these issues?
Yeah, one of the early convincing works that I read for anarchism was Rollback. Now, it doesn't actually make the message of anarchism clearly, if I remember correctly, but it really calls into question the legitimacy and the efficacy of pretty much every government program. And Tom Woods, is such an incredible writer. He does a really great job of sort of parsing a lot of those ideas out. The other book, the most recent one, is the recent New Right book by Michael Malice, where he does explicitly argue for anarchism and develops it with an anarchist foundation, but talks about sort of the history and growth of the New Right in contemporary politics. And I think that that's a great source for recent books that could still make an impact for today and be talking about contemporary issues. As far as foundational anarchist works, I think that Rothbard's a great place to start. The Anatomy of the State is digestible. You can get it on PDF on Mises.org. It's like 75 pages. And I think if you're sort of grappling or wrestling with the idea of the state as a legitimate organization or not, that's a great place to start.
Yeah, I think I got that maybe for just a couple bucks on Kindle. Yeah, that's a good one. Well, and as far as resources from you. So you've got a website, you're on social media a little bit. So if somebody wants to follow what you're doing or see what you're working on, where would they go?
Yeah, so I publish all of my stuff after the fact at antiwarwarvet.com. That's my blog. I'm trying to be a little bit more active now that I'm finishing up my bachelor program here in the fall. And I've also published a lot of those pieces on antiwar.com or the Libertarian Institute. I actually just submitted another work to Mises.org, so potentially I could get published there, which would be really exciting. But I'm trying to write a little bit more actively just because it's something that I really enjoy doing. It's really fulfilling for me. And it's also something I think I have a few perspectives that are relatively unique as a nurse in emergency medicine, considering the whole healthcare debate, and then as a vet being an ardent anti-war activist or advocate. Those are my two sort of beats, if I had to say.
And so that your website is antiwarwarvet.com.
Yep. And you can follow me with the same name, antiwarwarvet, on Twitter. I'm not super active on there, but if I get some followers, maybe I'll have to get back to it.
I think I found you on Instagram, but I think on Instagram you're just anti-warvet. Is that right?
Let me look, because I'm not actually sure. I would hope that I was smarter than that. Nope, same name, anti-war-war-vet.
Okay, I left out a war. Oh, yeah, you're right. Yeah, I must have read it too fast. Okay, anti-war-war-vet. You kept it consistent. All right, wow. So thank you, John, and really appreciate you taking the time to be here for this conversation. I hope it is useful for listeners.
Yeah, thanks so much, Cody. Take care.
You too.